Switching now to Iowa and the Democratic Party, which has finally reported all results from Monday's caucus. The state delegate count shows former Mayor Pete Buttigieg and Senator Bernie Sanders coming out on top. But CBS News cannot declare a winner in the race due to possible irregularities in the data. This comes as the Democratic National Committee chairman calls for a recanvass to assure results are accurate. Our Ed O'Keefe has the latest.
Well, it's fantastic news to hear that we won.
Former Mayor Pete Buttigieg and Senator Bernie Sanders are claiming victory in the Iowa caucuses.
We did very well. We won in Iowa.
Even saying so before the Iowa Democratic Party released the final results late Thursday.
If that argument is about electability and the ability to win, we just had the first election of the 2020 process.
So what I want to do today, 3 days late, is to thank the people of Iowa.
Why not let Iowa finish counting first before declaring victory?
Given the fact that we have waited 3 days, and now there is the talk of another recount, maybe we might want the decisions of the Iowa caucus before the November election.
With 100% of precincts now reporting, the results show Buttigieg with 26.2% of state delegates and Sanders 26.1%. But Sanders leads Buttigieg in the popular vote by more than 2,600 votes.
This was, a major league failure.
Democratic National Committee Chairman Tom Perez says there were errors reported in a number of Iowa precincts and a recanvass is necessary.
I want to make sure that every Iowa voter knows that their vote was counted.
But Sanders and Buttigieg want to move on and are looking ahead to Tuesday's primary.
I think we have an excellent chance to win here in New Hampshire.
Recent polling shows Sanders on top with Buttigieg closest behind, followed by Senator Elizabeth Warren, former Vice President Joe Biden, and Senator Amy Klobuchar.
New Hampshire is a state that has never been told what to do.
Right.
And we've got to earn every vote and earn a win on Tuesday night right here.
Another critical turning point in the campaign comes tonight when the candidates gather for a debate here in Manchester, 7 of them on stage together, and then a full weekend of campaigning. Vlad?
All right, Ed, thanks very much. Let's bring in CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns in Manchester, New Hampshire. Caitlin, as we heard in Ed's piece, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee is calling for a recanvass of the results from the Iowa caucuses. Could that affect the results that we've been given this far? And do the campaigns actually really care?
Hey, good morning, Vlad. Well, I don't think Perez's statement is going to have much bite because the Iowa Democratic Party requires a candidate to actually make that request for a recanvassing, and none of the candidates have asked for that. In fact, they are ready and willing to move on to New Hampshire. You have Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders declaring victories of their own in Iowa. Pete Buttigieg counting the delegate count, pointing to the delegate count, which shows him just a 1/10 of a percentage ahead of Bernie Sanders in that measure, and then Bernie Sanders claiming victory in the popular vote, arguing that that's going to matter really in a place like New Hampshire where there is a primary and not a caucus. And so you have the candidates already taking these victory laps from Iowa, not yet ready to call for recanvassing, instead ready to move on to the primary here in New Hampshire.
Right. So, as you know, Caitlin, Mayor Pete Buttigieg and Senator Bernie Sanders both declared victory in Iowa, coming in at just a 0.1% difference in state delegates. How are the candidates maintaining that momentum ahead of New Hampshire?
Right. Well, Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders hit the ground running here in New Hampshire, opening campaign events, talking about what they called their respective victories. Pete Buttigieg talking about the unlikely rise of his campaign. Remember, just after the caucuses ended and there were still no results, Pete Buttigieg did declare victory. Bernie Sanders held a press conference yesterday saying that he was ahead in the popular vote and was taking that as a victory. Meanwhile, you have questions about the viability of the campaigns of Joe Biden, who placed 4th in Iowa and is lagging behind in new polls out here in New Hampshire. He's been looking to states like Nevada and South Carolina, especially to make his case, kind of sees South Carolina as his firewall. But there are a lot of questions about whether he can actually get to that point if he doesn't do well here in New Hampshire. Then you have Elizabeth Warren, who had a robust ground game and big organization in Iowa, wasn't able to place in the top, although she did eke out Joe Biden. So there are questions about whether she can regain some footing here in New Hampshire, and that's critical for her because, of course, she's from neighboring Massachusetts. I will point out that the debate tonight will be really critical, and it's proven to be critical in the past. Do you remember 4 years ago to the day, really, or to this debate, Marco Rubio was headed into New Hampshire, poised for a good finish here, and instead had a terrible debate performance, and that really jeopardized him and sent him kind of into a tailspin here in New Hampshire. So all of these candidates have been preparing for this debate today. They have had light schedules over the past couple of days to be able to prepare for tonight, because that could be a turning point, especially because lots and lots of voters here are still undecided.
Let me ask you this, Caitlin. What do you make of the fact that folks like Vice President Biden, Senator Bernie Sanders, have had 4 years to sort of wow voters in these early states, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a mayor of South Bend, Indiana, comes roaring into the race and does just as well as Senator Sanders, and utterly, basically, you're looking at Joe Biden in 4th place if we go with the numbers that we are seeing right now. What does that tell you about the political landscape and the ability for those candidates, specifically Vice President Biden, to excite voters? Because he's the most well-known. He's the one with the name recognition. Yeah. He's the one who was the vice president to a very popular president within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Vlad. And in his closing arguments in Iowa, Pete Buttigieg was telling voters and caucus goers there that look at how Democrats have nominated winners in the past. He pointed to Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, especially in Iowa, saying that the party is able to win in November when it elects or if it nominates a candidate who's kind of outside of Washington or not really in the Washington model, who is someone new to the scene and kind of has some fresher perspective. And so that's something that he claimed in his closing arguments. Bernie Sanders has been able to keep a really strong base of support and activate and keep them motivated and activated throughout this process. But it does put a spotlight on Joe Biden, who has high name recognition. He did not have the organization necessary to succeed in the caucuses, and that is something that the campaign will have to really take a strong look at. In a primary, name recognition could be helpful because you're just going into the ballot box and checking off a name instead of going and participating in an hour-long or so caucus. So that could potentially help some candidates here. But it does raise this big question. And, you know, looking at the events for Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders, you're seeing a much more active crowd, an enthusiastic crowd. And that's why you see Joe Biden taking shots at Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg. He's been saying that to Democrats, if you elect Bernie Sanders, he says all Democrats running on that ballot will have to be painted with the Democratic Socialist label. And then he said Pete Buttigieg hadn't claimed any significant victories. Being mayor of South Bend, he said, isn't considered a big victory given how small that city is. But Pete Buttigieg is saying, well, look at the Iowa results. Mr. Former Vice President. That's what his closing argument here in New Hampshire has been. So all of these folks trying to really hit the ground running after the debate tonight and try to keep that momentum going, which is critical.
Let me ask you about Andrew Yang. He fired dozens of staffers after coming in at just 1% in the Iowa caucuses. Was this planned? Could we see a similar shakeup from other campaigns if New Hampshire does not go their way?
Yeah, the campaign is saying that this is part of the process as it moves on to New Hampshire, but he didn't have a strong showing at all in Iowa. He has been campaigning a lot on the ground here in New Hampshire and hopes to have somewhat of a strong finish. But I think you're going to see New Hampshire instead of Iowa play that winnowing role, or at least help narrow down the field. And I've been talking to a lot of voters on the ground here, a lot of them still undecided, but they are noting they like to speak to this old adage that is famous now in the state, that Iowa picks corn and New Hampshire picks presidents. That is something that a lot of voters here are focused on. They say, look, this is a primary. We're not going to have the same problems as Iowa. New Hampshire doesn't always take cues from anybody else, especially not Iowa. Remember, we've had this is a state that has nominated or has supported Pat Buchanan, Bernie Sanders last time around. So we'll see if New Hampshire goes the way of kind of being a decisive factor in this race, but they're certainly feeling the pressure is on, and New Hampshire voters are looking forward to that challenge.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns for us in New Hampshire. Thank you, Caitlin.